Hi everyone, this is Mr. Fowles, and we're going to be talking about the road to revolution, the American Revolution. So here's some belt work. 4 questions I'd like you to think about. The first 2 are kind of review, and the second 2 are forward-looking. So, who won the French and Indian War? What year did it end? Number 3, what is a debt? 4, what is a tax? Number 1, the answer is the British, not mentioned in the name of the war. 2, 1763. 3, money that you owe somebody else. 4, money that you pay the government for a particular good or service. Here are the notes, and we're going to go through them. And while we're going through this, I want you to think about the dates. That's kind of important. You want to note them. And I also want you to think about causes and effects, as we see here. Certain things caused other things, even on this list. And then think about our big question: how did colonists react to tighter British controls? So we have to kind of catch up. So if you think about it, we know that the colonies were settled, and that there were New England colonies and middle colonies and southern colonies, and they all did their various things. There were Quakers and Puritans and Pilgrims and Anglicans, and there was plantations, and there were ship buildings, and there was the triangle trade, and all this stuff happened. And all of these people living in the 13 colonies were English. They were English colonists. They were subjects to the English throne. And life was okay. There were a few conflicts with Native American tribes, but those usually ended in the colonists' favor. And then comes the French and Indian War, which is not a war that the colonists, per se, are fighting, but it's England fought this war against France, and it was part of the 7 Years' War, which was a global conflict between England and France and their various territories. And it ended in 1763, and the end result was that Great Britain got a great deal of territory in North America, and France gave away all of its holdings. And that ended in 1763. And I want you to think that, war is very expensive for any country. You have to pay soldiers, get equipment, lots of things. And Britain, to win the 7 Years' War that had fought all over the world, partially in North America, went into a great deal of debt. And if you remember that colonies were established by the royal crown, especially for mercantile purposes. There was a thing called mercantilism that said that, well, if I've got a colony, I can force them to buy my stuff, and I can get their stuff for cheap and make them buy my stuff whatever price I set. It's a monopolistic sort of economic environment. And so Britain, after being greatly in debt, turns to its colonies to raise funds. And how they did that is kind of the story of what made America America. So first they crushed the spirit. At the end of the French and Indian War, the proclamation of 1763 was passed, which even though England had territory west of the Appalachian Mountains, the proclamation said, well, you just can't go there. It was Native American ground. It was kind of the precursor to what are now reservations. And England was hoping to maintain that line, so colonists could have to stay in the colonies and not move farther west. Perhaps because the farther west they moved, the farther away they are from English control, but that's just my hypothesizing. And then there was a Quartering Act that sent soldiers to the colonies because there are other economic acts, and the soldiers were there to enforce them. And rather than pay for their own lodging, Parliament just passed a Quartering Act which said, hey, the soldiers get to stay for free in colonists' houses. And you had no choice, really, just to take them in. So it's kind of unfair. And then so these social sanctions were in place, and then came the economic sanctions. The Sugar Act and the Stamp Act, 1765 and 1766. Notice that where 1763 is the proclamation, 65 Quartering, 65 Sugar, 66 Stamp Act. So all these things came in what is relatively quick succession. The Sugar Act is pretty, you can read, it's a placed a tax on sugar. And the Stamp Act was a little more insidious. It required stamps on all sorts of legal documents, and and everything. So just like when you use the mail today, the postal service, you have to purchase a stamp to put on it. Anything that you did officially after the Stamp Act was passed required a stamp on it, and it was just an empty tax. Just you have to have the stamp, and it just raised money. And of course, people were not happy because they felt they were getting taxed without being represented. Taxation without representation became a rallying cry, and it means that the colonists were having to pay money to a government that didn't really support them. It just these taxes did not benefit the colonists at all. It benefited the crown, and they had no say in that. And there are echoes of that sentiment in the Declaration of Independence, which we will come to later. So there are some colonial responses. First was the Stamp Act Congress, which is people who united and drafted a petition to the king saying that they protested the Stamp Act, and not a big deal. And then the Sons of Liberty, they were small secret societies. I liken them to guerrilla fighters who carried out covert attacks on British officials, and they burned stamps, and they were more violent in their protests. And then there was an economic sanction of the boycott. So we have like a political response, a military response, and an economic response. And the boycott said, well, the colonists just refused to buy English goods, even though that they were in high demand because England could provide all these, refined materials that English and other European artisans were good at doing, and the colonists, had to deal with. And they didn't have the resources of the colonial or the historical heritage of Europe, but they said, well, we'll just boycott, and that put a lot of economic pressure on Britain. So the Stamp Act was repealed in 1766. So that saved a lot of stress for the colonists. However, it was replaced with the Declaratory Act, which said more or less that we are your masters and we can do what we want. And it was just an overarching authority to impose any sort of taxes needed. And therefore, shortly thereafter came the Townshend Acts. The H is silent. You don't pronounce that H, so it's Townshend. Townshend Acts of 1767, which is a tax on imports. So the colonists agreed, ended the boycott, and then imports started flowing again, and then there was a tax placed on those imports, just kind of on glass, paper, paint, lead, and tea. Tea will be extremely important. I don't know why there's such a huge historical significance on a social beverage, but tea plays a big part of America's independence movement. So the Townshend Acts were imposed, tax on imports, and there was a large influx of English troops to support these sanctions. And when you have a large military presence, sometimes there are problems, as this picture can illustrate. This picture, by the way, was an engraving by Paul Revere, whose name will come up again. This is in Boston, and you can see there's some guys here in red coats, and these are called muskets. Here's a bunch of dying and dead people, and a dog. And what occurred, this is March 5th, 1770, and this is a rather incendiary representation of it. However, the understood facts are that soldiers were there, a bunch of young colonists gathered around, maybe started heckling them, and then they started heckling back, and they were yelling at each other, and some guy threw a snowball, and then all of a sudden shots were fired, and 5 people were killed, including Crispus Attucks, who was a former slave. He had run away, and notice he's not presented here in the picture. There is no African American in the picture, but So, that should not be an S. 1 month after the Boston Massacre, Parliament, which is England's government, they repealed the Townshend Acts. Like, hey, I mean, there's no one knows why. I mean, there's no. They didn't say we're doing this in response to the Boston Massacre, but it was 1 month after, and all the other. So the things that were taxed were what we got here: tea, glass, paper, paint, and lead. So they got rid of all of them except for tea. Tea being a very popular beverage in English culture that had come to America. So the colonists, they said, okay, we'll just buy Dutch tea. And in 1773, so we're just a couple years after there, 1773, England says, well, you can't buy tea from Holland. You got to buy it from us now. And it was specifically to the East India Company who had the rights to purchase or to sell the tea. The East India Company. So, kind of saying, if you tell people that they can only buy this product that is very important to them from one place, that place can set any price they want. If I'm the only person selling water in a very hot place, I can charge people anything I want. If I'm charging $8 for a bottle of water, and then people are really desperate for water, they're going to buy it from me. But all somebody would have to do is come and sell water for $7, and my business would be gone. And this is, this kind of is reminiscent of the Navigation Acts that gave rise to a great deal of piracy. If you kind of remember that. So this kind of led to this event here. Now notice these fellas here look like what we call Native Americans, but these were actually just Bostonians dressed up in Native American apparel, throwing tea into the harbor, Boston Harbor. And they threw a total of 342 chests of tea into that harbor. And, the idea was that we're not going to drink this infernal tea that you are overcharging us for, and you're giving us no. They were denied the rights of the free market. And since they were being denied that, this was an act of protest. And beyond a boycott. This is just destruction. And these were the Sons of Liberty who carried this out, that kind of guerrilla troop I told you about. And this is one of their acts. And you can almost say that it bordered on political theater more than anything else. And, that's old. But that's it, really. So we have all these events that, I'm going to just run back here. The Quartering Act, and the Sugar Act, and the Stamp Act were all acts that put pressure on the colonies to try to get money from them. And the Tea Act as well, that was a couple years later. And the Boston Massacre was a result of the pressure applied in enforcing these acts. And then the Boston Tea Party was a result of the Tea Act, which said that it wasn't a tax, but it essentially was a tax because it said that only one company could sell tea in the colonies. So think about causes and effects. How did the Tea Act cause the Boston Tea Party? What's the connection there? How did the Boston Massacre lead to something to do with the Townshend Acts? There's a connection there you can maybe think about. And where does the boycott fit in all this? How does the Sugar and Stamp Act lead to a boycott, causes and effects there? And you can kind of think about that. But think, how did the colonists react to tighter British controls? How are they feeling? And that's something to think about on your own as you kind of think over this. Maybe read the chapter. It's actually 2 sections we just kind of breezed over. So that's it. Thank you very much.